All right, Immersive Programming Series, Episode 5. In this one, we're going to take a look at macrocycles and long-term planning. So quick caveat before I jump into this one. Please understand that this is really coming from the perspective of somebody who does not work with athletes pretty much at all for a year time frame or longer. And this is also coming from somebody who's in the private sector. So bear in mind as we're going through this that this is not exactly going to be direct to high school group sports or group athletes, college sector, full teams, things like that. There's definitely people out there that are way better resources than me for that. But as it applies to more of the private sector, one-on-one, and, again, kind of like within a year type of start to finish programming, that's really where this is all going to be generated from. The first thing that we need to do, as we've talked about in some of our previous episodes of this series, is understand that we need to identify our needs. So these needs can be really filled in or populated with anything. So for what I have here for athlete KPIs, movement and capacity, strength and stability, power and elasticity, speed and sensory, these are just my very general, broad organizational categories that, barring anybody with independent or specific things that they're bringing to the table, this is generally what I'm going to work from. And with these, we want to analyze these for how they compare to the demands of sport, making sure that they're relative for the age and the position of the athlete. As we know, an offensive lineman and a safety for football are not going to have the same type of programming schematics. So what we want to do is make sure that we're organizing those not just based off of sport alone, but then again from their age and then their position. And we can always use normative values for comparison on that, but quite frankly, I'm more of a fan of testing against the athlete, from what we've done previously or what they've done previously. Really irrespective of whether or not injury was involved, I really want to take a look at where were they in 2021 to where they are now in 2022, and then moving forward, where are they trying to be in 23, 24, so on and so forth. But with this, we also want to, make sure that we're considering essentially our constraints and our conflicts. And this is something that Mike Boyle actually just put something out on recently, and he's talked about extensively. But, even though this seems very simple, it is something that often gets overlooked. But when you're putting your programming together, the first thing that I do is I put in all of the things that are going to blockade me, all of the constraints, and highlighting any kind of conflicting events, or for those who work in the high school or the college athlete sector, high academic stress periods are going to be something that you're going to want to take note of. When are they going to be on break? When do they have different kinds of school or life events going on? All of these things need to be considered up front because they're going to determine how we're going to organize the remaining time that we do have. We can also take this a step further and just simply say, what does the equipment availability look like? What does the space look like? If you have 3,000 square feet and 10 athletes, that looks dramatically different than if you have 5,000 square feet and you're working in groups of 3. So those kinds of things are very, very important to recognize up front. And then again, making sure that you have good utility within your training space and you're utilizing things in a very efficient and economical manner. Generally speaking, for strength and conditioning or performance programming, it needs to be understood that this is a systems approach. And I think I've spoken about this at great lengths by now, but especially in the strength and conditioning world, we get way too myopic in just looking at the musculoskeletal tissue or system and really trying to oversaturate that, because we often look at our role as being somewhat reductionist, where, hey, we lift weights and we run sprints. And I get that. I understand that populates the majority of our work. But just because we wear a hat that says strength and conditioning, it doesn't mean that we are ignorant to or we neglect things like cognitive acuity, cardiac and metabolic function, immune system function. So really this goes back to that first pillar of the athlete KPIs, where, the general capacity and the general, kind of health, wellness, function, whether you're working with high school athletes or you're working with veteran military, in either population, if they are constantly sick, sore, they're having, difficulties sleeping, their nutrition is out of whack, they don't have good stress management protocols, then you're just going to be fighting this uphill battle with the strength and conditioning piece, and everything you do is going to be more strenuous and you'll get less return on it. So a lot of these things are very easy, and really all you need to do is just kind of delay the introduction to the conventional strength training or the conventional, speed and power work, and just start out by just getting people to basic health levels. And, a good number to work off of for that is just simply 60 beats per minute for a resting heart rate. If you have a resting heart rate that's above 60 beats per minute, we have some work that we can do on the aerobic side that's going to, do us a tremendous benefit down the road when we do get to the more strength and conditioning based stuff. But beyond that, the body is a collective outcome of multiple individual systems performing specific functions in harmony. So when we see, the skeletal system, the connective tissue system, and the muscular system as identified here, and then obviously to include the nervous system, endocrine system, all those things, these things have specific functions and roles. The way that bones work is dramatically different than fascia and ligaments, which is dramatically different than, tendons and muscle. And so the way that I kind of loosely associate these is I look at the skeletal system as being predominant for force dispersion, the connective tissue system being predominant for force transmission, and then the muscular system being, our predominant force expression system. So for the sake of this simplicity here, if we have an athlete who struggles with force expression but does very well with force dispersion and transmission, then we need to emphasize our programming on building out the force expression piece. More commonly, we tend to see people who are pretty good with force expression, decent with force dispersion, but have a lot of trouble here in the force transmission. So for this sake, I'm going to de-emphasize the musculoskeletal system, or the muscular system rather, and I'm going to put more attention on, building up the connective tissue system, or the capability of force transmission. And what I've always believed and continue to live by closely is the greater the relative imbalance between these systems, the greater the potential there is for illness or injury. So again, we can look at that as the immune system versus the musculoskeletal system, or we can look at it as being, delineated between these three here. But one mistake that I've made certainly, and I know that, has plagued some other coaches as well, is, when you see an athlete who's a stud and they come in and they just, they look like DK Metcalf, and you just assume like, okay, well, this person is obviously not going to have any health issues. They're not going to have any problems with, cardiac function or anything like that. Don't make that assumption ever. What you see is not indicative of what's under the hood in a lot of cases. And with things like cardiac function especially, or immune system function, you're much better off taking the 10 to 15 minutes that it takes to evaluate these things rather than just assuming they're good to go and then having consequences down the road. But as it applies to this, for the sake of programming, the difference in these systems, and again, from function to efficiency and output and capacity, when we see glaring differences between systems, sometimes that can be explained by sport, but other times those are things that are red flags. So we want to make sure that we're considering how the training stressors and the volume and the frequency and all of these things are affecting the body just beyond the muscular output. That also rolls right into the recovery and the restoration phase, where, the easiest one to pick on with this is when, there was a huge trend in baseball of, quote unquote, flushing the lactic acid out and doing, pole runs or something like that. Not only is that just fundamentally incorrect, but what they were trying to do was, quote unquote, push lactic acid and get fluid moving to diminish soreness, so to speak. But really what they're doing is they're just adding excessive stress on the connective tissue, really, by doing these trotting, low velocity type of runs just for the sake of doing them under fatigue. You're putting shearing stress and poor force transmission on the connective tissue, and you're not doing what you're trying to do from a recovery standpoint. So that's a double negative. But to wrap that up, the overall goals here, number one, be healthy enough to be consistent. If you aren't healthy and you aren't able to, maintain good sleep patterns, nutrition, hydration, stress management, then all the programming shit really just kind of, falls on deaf ears. I mean, we really got to just make sure that we're not putting the cart before the horse. Mentally well in order to focus. If somebody is battling a lot of, stress with school, relationship, or just general work or life stress, change the programming. It's not a matter of figuring out how to push them through it or get them through it. It's your job to modify and alter what is expected from the programming standpoint based on what we're experiencing in life, whether that's preemptive or it's retroactively. And then to close out, physically prepared for the demands of sport and address the systems independently and collectively to maximize efficiency. So that's, really what we'll get into right here. First, though, quickly on fascial considerations, this is an important slide because I think with, again, the conventional nature of strength and conditioning, we have just been beaten over the head with how do we maximize muscular capacity and output, how do we maximize tendon output, and those things are great. It's not saying that we're doing this supplemental to that, but we need to understand that when we prioritize or we emphasize specific systems, muscular, tendinous, or otherwise, those have effects, whether they're direct or indirect, on the additional systems. So the fascial system, obviously, something that I'm very big on, has different training parameters and protocols to be emphasized in training than if we have something that's more musculoskeletal based. So for the fascial system, the number one thing that's most important here is understanding that the less elastic fascia becomes, the harder muscle has to work. So if we get into phases of programming where it's consistently 85% and up, we have consistently high volumes with high compound loading, high force loading. Those are things that while they are developing the strength and the force expression, we may be doing damage or doing harm for the sake of the connective tissue and the force transmission component. In addition to that, movement needs to be undertaken in all directions. We want to use a wide variety of load parameters, speeds, positions, all these things that we continue to discuss with the fascial system. Pursuing variability, so to speak, for a good portion of training. Beyond that, we want to look at the stiffness at, particularly the mechanical junction. So we're thinking about like the musculotendinous junction or the myofascial force expansion. When we see things like a lunge that can't be sequenced, step to step, or if we're looking at, medicine ball throws that are just disconnected and disjointed, those are basically examples of quote unquote bleeding energy or losing effectiveness with our stretch shortening cycle. So if we see that is a different protocol than somebody who, like we mentioned at the top, is losing their elastic properties. Elasticity and stiffness are essentially polar opposites. So even within just the fascial considerations here, we can see a difference in programming schematic based on those two things. And then coming down to the bottom here, we talked a good bit about the proportionality, so it's the same conversation here between fascia and muscle. And then we go back to our ability to recover. So when we think about fascia, we think about the connection to the circulatory system and the lymphatic system. And if we have stagnated flow, in particular compartments of the body, or we just have generally poor viscous properties, or the fascial tissue can't really slide or glide rather across or atop its different layers, that's going to reduce the amount of flow, and then that's going to then delay our ability to recover, which then is going to create impaired adaptations. So now getting to kind of our general priorities for annual planning or for a macro cycle, and just to make a note of it, for me, a macro cycle is really going to be about 12 weeks. And I know that that's not conducive to like conventional textbook definitions of it, but again, I don't really program for anybody for a year. It's just not the world that I'm in. So for me, I look at about 3 months as being a macro cycle, and then each month within that 3-month window being my mesocycles, and then each week or 2 weeks within the month being my microcycles. So with that, I'm going to really try to work through 4 base pillars or priorities. I want to build the base, develop the structure, make the structure functional, and then make the functional structure fast. So for build the base, getting a little bit redundant here, but are they healthy? Are they sick? Are they chronically fatigued? What does their aerobic capacity look like? What does their HRV look like is another good measure to take a look at. And do they generally have capacity for their sport? Are they constantly winded during games or practices? Are they getting beat up when they have back-to-back games, or if they have an extended stretch of practice? We just want to analyze those things for what they're worth. Developing the structure is essentially giving us our base parameters here. So we're thinking about our general strength endurance, base hypertrophy, general mobility, flexibility, and then starting to close down on those margins of difference between systems as we were discussing a slide ago. Making the structure functional is going to start to get more into the specificity piece. So now we're starting to think about our sport-specific type of strength, our sport-specific bioenergetics or our conditioning splits, starting to develop our power and our anaerobic capacity. And then as we come down again into our last pillar here for making functional fast, now we're thinking about our sport-specific speed, our velocity-based lifts and movements, and then really trying to hone in on our max speed and max acceleration phases. So how does this look when we break it all out? Well, we'll take a look at two different slides here that kind of organize this. But, again, we're looking at, really 4 months or 12 to 16 weeks as being kind of my definition of a macro cycle. And all of this starts with one of my favorite sayings, and that's generalize where you can, specialize when you must. So really we want to be as general as we possibly can and just really focus on kind of the big rocks until we are prompted to start to specialize and get into more of the specificity type of applications. So this really works well because as we kind of go through from phase 1 down to phase 4 or May to August, this is going to kind of naturally be more generalized. And then from 2, 3 to 4, by the time we get down to 4, it's going to be pretty spot on specific to whatever the demands are for the athlete or for the sport. But you can modify and tailor this however it fits you best, right? And we can fluctuate how long our microcycles are, how long our mesocycles are, and what our total macro cycle is going to look like. So generally speaking, I kind of follow the Charlie Francis type of thinking, or I know Franz Bosch has kind of instructed this as well to some level. But essentially, I'm a believer that every phase should include every different subcategory or topic of training. So we talked about our 4 main pillars being movement and capacity, strength and stability, power and elasticity, speed and sensory. And you see here, we'll just say arbitrarily this is a fall sport athlete, so volleyball or football or whatever. In May, we're really just focusing mostly on building out our capacity, working on general tissue quality, aerobic base, things like that. We'll work some strength and stability in there. And just because it's not a priority or a focus doesn't mean it's not involved. So really, if we double these together, 20% of our work or our time, training is going to still include power, speed, sensory, elasticity work. Phase 2, we see that there's a shift now where the main priority is going to be our strength and stability. So this is going to populate about 50% of our total programming input, and then we'll distribute pretty evenly across movement and capacity, power and elasticity, speed and sensory. Now we come over again into phase 3 or July. Now our predominant work is going to be in our power and elasticity phase. Our second emphasis is going to start to become more the speed and sensory. And then again, even though it's not a priority, still keeping some movement, capacity, strength, and stability work in there. And then lastly, coming down into phase 4 here, now we're in a full speed and sensory phase. So for here, this is going to be our main entree, but I want to start to build back in a little bit more strength and stability, as you see here, going from 10% of total programming to 20%, because now we're getting ready to get into game mode. So I want to just make sure that our base strength and stability capacity is good to go, and then kind of feeding it out there from to finish out with some power and some movement and capacity. So as we look at this in the same kind of split, just with a little bit of different notes here, your movement and capacity phase is going to be consisting of mostly aerobic strength and endurance. So this is going to be, for me, generally below 60%. And that's something I will make a caveat on is, people think that really the bottom end of programming prescription is 60, 65, 70%. And I fully disagree. I have plenty of programming situations where I'll go down to 20, 25, 30%, 40%. Those lighter loads do absolutely have value, especially when we're talking about the fascial system or connective tissue system. But this is also going to correspond mostly to a zone 2 heart rate, and we're going to think about kind of gradually increasing our volume as we're going through that phase. For strength and stability, this is going to be more of our conventional hypertrophy strength parameters. So for here, where we're below 60 in the first phase, now we're going to jump up to be above 80%. So the caveat here is I know that looks like a major jump going from 60% to 80%, but the reality is in our 4th week of this phase here, that last week of May, I'll probably end up touching right around 65 or 70%. And then generally speaking, my first week of this strength and stability phase will probably be, closer to 75%, give or take. But beyond that, this is going to correspond to a zone 2-3 heart rate, and we're going to think about having kind of diminishing volume as we're going through this phase. So we would start with, for instance, like an 80% with looking at, 50 to 60 total reps. As we get to the end of this cycle, it would be, for our primary lifts, more like sets of 1 or 2 at 90-95%, with the total volume of being under 20 reps. So that's kind of how that's going to contrast throughout. As we get into our power and elasticity, now we're going to kind of transition from more aerobic work on the conditioning side to being more anaerobic and kind of strength speed focus. So this will correspond to more moderate loading, going back down between 80 to 60%, and that will work in a descending fashion where we would start this phase out closer to 80% and we would finish it out closer to 60% as we approach our speed and sensory. Zone 3 to 4 heart rate range, so we're going to get higher intensities but with with greater rest time and less total volume in most cases, and generally speaking, this is a moderate volume phase. Lastly, for speed and sensory, now we're thinking purely alactic, anaerobic, speed strength type of application. So this is going to be back below 60% with high intensity heart rate zones, but it's going to be moderate to diminishing volume, and it's going to be very short intervals. So we're thinking about, full max effort, 20-yard flies, 10-yard flies, obviously any kind of change of direction work, things like that. And then this again is going to start as a moderate volume and then kind of diminish as we go down. And that's mostly because we're anticipating, kind of the start of the sports season, so to speak. But if we look at this in totality, we're going to spend, if this is a 16-week block here, 4 weeks are going to be a reasonably below 60%. 4 weeks are going to be above 80%. And then we'll have one phase that will be 4 weeks between 80 and 60%, but that is with, specifically high effort or high intent. So light weights moved fast, and then we're back below 60%. So really, technically speaking here, for the way that this is laid out, this would be about 8 weeks of 60% and below, and then about 8 weeks of 60% and up, which is, when you look at it from a 10,000 foot view like that, would probably surprise a lot of people. But again, that's really just where my belief is. And to close it out here, if we look at just a hypothetical example, so let's just say we're in the private sector and I have a college football player who's a wide receiver, and then I have a college athlete or a college basketball player, both working in kind of their early to late off-season phases. And, for the sake of this, we'll just say everything is perfect, no injuries, everything is working in our favor. So for the college football player, we see that there's going to be a little bit more of a distribution across those 4 main KPIs, whereas for the basketball player, we're really going to focus in that first 4 weeks on just improving movement and capacity and strength and stability. It's going to predominate pretty much all of our work. For the football player, when we get into mid to late off season, this basically just becomes mostly power work and then strength and stability work. And it flips for the basketball player, where now we're going to kind of split more evenly across all 4 of those subcategories. As we look to the preseason and our final 4-week cycle here for both athletes, we really transition into being focused on our speed and our sensory work. So obviously, for the sake of basketball and for the sake of football, those will be different types of inputs. But when we're looking at the general training priorities or parameters, those will be actually pretty similar as we get into the preseason phase. Hope that was informative for you all. Again, with this immersive programming series, really, I'm just trying to kind of give, the detailed points or elements of how I go about programming. So I've had a few people hit me up on these, just kind of, making some recommendations or suggestions on things for me to go to, and I'm happy to take those on. So if you have anything, that you want to specifically hear me talk through, please feel free to shoot us a message. And last note here, the FASCIA Chronicles just released about 2 weeks ago, and we've gotten nothing but really positive feedback on this. We're very excited with how this came out. So make sure you check that out. Head to our site. We have a link up there for the product. And then, our great partners at Simply Faster also have something on their page. So you can head over there to check it out as well. But outside of that, hit me up if you have any questions on anything, and we will look forward to dropping the next episode here soon.